the first story of the day is the story coming out of South Africa that a coalition government has been formed. And interesting, it says, the headline, we go to the Financial Times for the first story of the day. And it says, South Africa DA signs power sharing deal with the ANC. Not the other way around. Voluntary national. That's, I mean, when I was reading it, that's the first thing that jumped out at me.
Yes, I'm glad you caught it quickly, and I hope that our comrades who join us on a weekly basis also start catching something like that very quickly. And that really tells you the entire story right there.
Okay. So it gets interesting. It gets more interesting, rather. So we've got the Voluntary National Unity Government will allow Cyril Ramaphosa to remain in power. Okay. The lead is South Africa's ruling National Congress has signed a landmark power sharing deal with the Democratic Alliance, paving the way for a new government to be formed under the leadership of ANC Cyril Ramaphosa, who happens to be the president of South Africa. Such a deal was vital to allowing the ANC, which lost its majority for the first time since the end of white minority rule 30 years ago in the May election, to remain in power with a working majority. And okay, the 9-page, there was a series of agreement, discussions and meetings, which culminated in a 9-page document which commits the party to cooperate through a voluntary government of national unity. Significantly, however, Julius Malema's economic freedom fighters and Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto Sigwe, both radical parties that promote nationalization of banks and important industries, are not part of the pact. It gets more interesting. Signed by the ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula and DA's chairman Heli Zille, the document lays out the mechanics for coalition rule, from how cabinets will be constituted to guidelines for policy and dispute resolution. Zille told the Financial Times that this was a significant development for the country. This gives, in quotes, South Africa a chance of creating a stable democracy and an inclusive economy, she said. The document stipulates while the president retains the power to appoint his cabinet, this should be done in consultation with the leaders of the respective parties. Now, there is another part here. Okay, yeah. The leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, told reporters the deal was a historical movement for the country which will allow his party to now co-govern. He said, and I quote, "The EFF and the MK do not share the constitutional principles that will ensure the country progress." He said if the ANC had chosen to go into partnership with those two, the DA would not have joined the government. Yes. A lot to...
Yeah, I mean, this is it speaks to where Africa is today since Ghana won its independence in 1957.
Correct.
It is a sad testament to how we have retrogressed and gone backward. This is, of course, a backward march, even though the Financial Times refers to the Democratic Alliance, the DA, as quote-unquote liberal. That, of course, is nonsense. This is the most radical of all the parties. Why is it radical? Because it basically, it's preaching the Bible of apartheid. It opposes any land reform in a country where 80%, the black majority, own 4%. In a country where the Europeans, who make up 7.3% of the population, own 72%. In a country where unemployment of black people is 37%, while that of European South Africans is only 7.4%. And they are saying this is what represents, quote, stability and democracy. In fact, it represents the opposite, because this is what apartheid was all about, to exclude the majority population, not only from political power, but from the benefits of the economic prosperity, from the wealth of South Africa. So we have an alliance now between the party that led the struggle for national liberation, the African National Congress, going back in bed with the party of apartheid. And of course, it's historic. It's historic in the sense that South Africa, at least for the time being, has surrendered the march toward independence and decolonization and has taken several steps backward. And also, it is significant that the other minor party that is included in this alliance, the Inkatha Freedom Party, was once also in bed with the apartheid regime. As you remember, the late Buthelezi, Gatsha Buthelezi, who was the leader of that party for a long time, often betrayed the national liberation struggle and worked in cahoots with the apartheid regime. After Mandela was released in 1990 up to 1994, who was instigating the instability in South Africa? To discourage the elections in 1994, that was to include and eventually included all the ethnic groups in South Africa and nationalities. It was the National Party of Apartheid in cahoots with Inkatha. They were instigating violence between supporters of the African National Congress and Inkatha Party to give the impression to the global community that Africans will not be able to run the state. So now you look, they're all on the same side now. The ANC, the DA, which of course is just a new form of the National Party, and the Inkatha Freedom Party. So I submit that this is not stable at all. In fact, it's a very dangerous government because it means that they want to exclude the conversation of how to redistribute the national wealth and to really bring some of the prosperity to the underserved and exploited, economically exploited majority population of Africans in South Africa. And of course, it should not be surprising that the Financial Times would celebrate this, just like the Economist magazine was celebrating this, and the New York Times was also celebrating this. So it's no surprise there.
Can I just also add this last part?
Yes.
The investors said they preferred a deal between the ANC and the pro-market DA, believing it will ensure stable policy and potentially accelerate the economic growth. The rand, which had weakened to touch 19 rands to the dollar in recent days amid fears of a coalition between the ANC and leftist EFF, strengthened after the news of a deal with the DA to around 18.33.
Okay, so here's the irony of all of this. Number one, what was colonialism all about? It was about you not being in control of your production and your sovereignty and your government. So the Financial Times is telling us that it is investors and how the comfort level of investors that should determine the government of South Africa, number one. Number two, here's the biggest irony of all that is not mentioned in this article. The irony is that in these Western countries, right?
Yes.
In the United States, in Britain, other parts of Western Europe, there is tremendous pressure against the state. In fact, most of these countries have a leftward leaning push, particularly by the younger generation, right? So in your own country, you're dealing with the pressure that's been created by the accumulation of wealth within a small percentage of the very rich elite in these countries. You're dealing with that pressure. And yet you're celebrating that this pressure of accumulation just within a small minority should continue in other parts of the world, including South Africa. It's utter nonsense, of course.
So, finally, what in terms of because I noticed you wrote an op-ed on your Facebook wall with regards to the situation. What would be your overriding takeaway from the entire coalition government arrangement?
My takeaway is that this is a transition, a transitory measure. It will not survive. I will not be surprised if it collapses much sooner than many people anticipate.
Okay.
The pressures are tremendous. You cannot have 37% Black unemployment. You cannot have 80% of the population in control of 4% of the land. It's preposterous. And that's part of the irony. You would hope that the European South African population would have much more enlightened leadership who come up and say, we've had a very good long run of centuries. We cannot continue to subjugate the majority of population economically. They did not, as Cabral said, Amilcar Cabral, that people support the national liberation struggle, not for some ideological issues. They want better standard of living for themselves and their family. If it applied in Guinea-Bissau, it applies in South Africa.